I want to talk a little bit more about what I was talking about yesterday, which had to do with talking openly about experiences that we've had in our different altered states of consciousness. And in my case, my altered states of consciousness resulted in a mental health diagnosis of bipolar 1 with psychotic features. And the conversations that I'm talking about are not necessarily about disputing a diagnosis or trying to get rid of it or explain it away, but rather to expand the conversation and expand the language and the vocabulary that we use to describe some of our inner subjective experiences relating to the diagnosis or, the whole process before diagnosis. In my case, I was in an altered state for 2 months before I was hospitalized and then given a diagnosis. And during those 2 months, I would have never guessed that at the end of it all, it was going to be explained in terms of a mental health diagnosis. It felt like some sort of spiritual journey and spiritual experience. A lot of it was really scary, and a lot of it was really blissful. But I never thought that I was mentally ill. I was told that. So if I could imagine going back to how I felt about the situation on a daily basis as I was experiencing it before I was given a mental health diagnosis, I could probably share a lot of different things if I could pretend that I was never given the diagnosis, and then, I just got through that crisis and got back to some sort of normal functioning without being given a diagnosis and without being given medication. I know that didn't happen, but what I'm saying is I would have a very large amount of things to share and talk about and different wonderings and curiosities, and I would be sort of in awe of the experience, and I would think it was kind of mysterious and wonderful and magical, even though there was a lot of really scary stuff too. I'm not trying to glorify these states as something that I would want to exist in all the time. I'm just saying that in retrospect, if I was to talk about it without having a diagnosis, I would share something a lot different than after I was diagnosed. And after I was diagnosed, I was told how to interpret everything that went on and just explain it away in terms of a mental illness. And basically that gave me the impression, and it wasn't an impression, it was pretty obvious, which was, don't talk about what happened. There's no point in talking about what happened and what you experienced because it was just a mental illness. And I think that is a mistake. I feel that there's a lot of really interesting conversation that can come out of the experiences, and that maybe it's conversation that we need to start having. And again, that doesn't mean that I say I completely disagree with my diagnosis. I'm just saying that's a very small amount of the overall story. That's part of the story, but it's not the entire story. And I think that, it's troublesome to assume that just because I have that diagnosis that that's the end of the story in terms of everything that I experienced. That would be like saying to someone who has cancer to just say, I have cancer, and not share any of the story or struggles or anything about it. just say I have cancer. So if I'm supposed to just say, well, I have bipolar disorder, and not say anything that I went through, and I have shared stuff before, but a lot of it's in terms of like my recovery journey. So it's like, well, these are the symptoms I had. This is how I've gone about my recovery journey. And that, that's usually for like a hopeful story for people to get better. But, that's like the diagnosis assumes there's going to be some kind of recovery story. And so a recovery story implies a diagnosis, and a diagnosis implies there'll be some kind of recovery story. Well, what about all the other stories? Yes, there is a story of recovery, but there's also stories from the experiences and what that meant and what it means. So much of life has become quite meaningless, and for me the states of mania and psychosis are very meaningful. And I'm not meaning meaningful in terms of the meaning that I would like to just put onto it. So often when we have an experience, we think it means a certain thing to us, which is usually projected from our past. So in my experiences in altered states, in mania and psychosis, there's a lot of different meanings that I see that I wouldn't necessarily choose. So, for example, if I have a delusion of some sort, what's called a delusion, I might conclude that that means I have to die. Now that's some meaning. It's not meaning that I want or what I choose, but there's a lot of that type of meaning, from I'm the worst in the world to I'm right up there with God. So the feelings and the meanings are very diverse and very rich, and I don't feel like talking about those meanings is the purpose would be to be like, I want to cling to the good meanings and get rid of the bad, because that would just be choosing based on our own personal preferences, which are conditioned. And that's like using the ego to sort of choose. But I feel like the overall flavor can be extracted. And I've talked about before how sometimes there are messages, and there are special messages, and there's a lot of thinking that special messages are bad. And I talked about before how, yes, if I was to get a special message every second of every day, that would be not good. It would be a little overwhelming. We aren't really designed to handle that amount of meaning that seems special and meaningful personally. And I feel like reality in the world actually needs these special messages. It needs some people to feel like they're getting special messages from somewhere that are particularly designed for them. It's almost like saying, here's your meaning in life. We're all looking for it, and we assume that we have to work hard to look for it. And then sometimes people go into a manic state, and it's sort of given to them on a silver platter. And the trouble is that it's a very high energy state, and if a person is in a high energy state for a long period of time and then they come out of it, it makes sense that it's going to take a little bit of time to re-equilibrate to consensus reality. So psychosis and depression are kind of like a hangover from being in a different dimension of this reality. And it takes some time to recover. And so yeah, the conversation isn't about negating the mental illness paradigm. It's just about expanding on it and having more options of the language that we can choose to use, at least with each other, to expand our vocabulary on how we talk about the experience. And just doing that could be a bit validating. And again, it's not to be thinking that we want to go back into those states. I actually feel like by talking about it more, we're less likely to go back into those states because it's made into conversation of the whole. So it's not like something other that would be felt as, oh, I'm going into something other than reality. And if nothing less, it would be slightly entertaining to share some of our stories of what we experienced and felt and thought when we were in those states. I think together we could probably create some really good movie scripts. And there's how much of that is actually still hidden within people who have never spoken about their experiences. And there's a lot of good stuff in there. So I feel like I can have both a brain disease and lots of good stories. Lots of good stories that came out of that brain disease, if that's what it is. And it feels like it's a brain disease, it's a disease of meaning. There's so much meaning in there, and a lot of it is not coherent, it's not congruent, it's ascribing meaning to things where there is no real meaning. But it's like everything that we see when we're in that state of consciousness feels like there's some kind of meaning. So the brain is making up the meaning. And maybe some of that meaning can be brought into daily life. That's what I'm interested in the most. There is a quote in a book, and the book is called, I can't remember, but the quote says something about, I don't care about your spiritual experience, I care about what you do with it afterwards. And that really resonates with me because spiritual experiences are transient. They don't happen all the time. But what can be taken out of that experience? If that spiritual experience didn't transform how a person is going to be in their daily life moving forward, then it didn't really have any value. And if it's just going to be held on to and wished for again, there's drugs for that. It's not really any different than just taking a drug, which has maybe some value in like ceremony, but not really something to be repeated. It's like a learning, it's like a journey thing. And mania and psychosis to me feel like a journey inward. So I think a person can both have a brain disease diagnosis and be a visionary. And a visionary just is a person who has visions and sees things differently, and there's a lot of incongruence in the state of mania and psychosis between the inner and the outer. And that's one of the reasons why behavior doesn't really match up. If I'm experiencing something inwardly that isn't happening outwardly, and I'm behaving based on the inward part, and somebody sees me and it doesn't match up, they will wonder. And what I'm thinking is that there's a certain level of having a vision or seeing things in reality, in daily reality, that aren't congruent with how things maybe should be in the world. Like, say, people killing each other and stuff. And normally we can walk by that, and not walk by, but sort of get by knowing that that's happening. And then in those other states, a person becomes so sensitive that it's like, well, I can't stand that. So it's almost like not being okay with that stuff happening. So that's part of, to me, I feel like that's one of the things that starts some of the incongruence, is that our inner becomes incongruent with the outer, in that what is really happening in the world for real, that we don't necessarily witness on a daily basis, we get discontented by, really. And maybe a person retreats inside to some kind of utopia, or this idea that we can actually do something about it. In mania, we feel like, hey, there's something I can do about the world. I can help the world. I can change the world. Well, maybe we need people that actually think that way. And even though it gets out of hand in mania, perhaps it only gets out of hand because there's only a few people in mania doing that. Whereas if people consciously decided to be like that collectively, there wouldn't be any manic weirdos out there. There would be, if people were in mania, they would probably be providing a lot of insight and ideas and visions for the people that actually wanted to take action. So to me, a person in mania is almost like a leader in a way. But one gets lost in one's own inner vision, an inner manifestation, and we don't know how to make it manifest outwardly. And that's why we need to start talking to each other. Because, all these visions are sort of within us and among us, but we're not sharing them. And then if we're not able to take some sort of collective action towards that. Because our visions are pretty big, and it's hard to do that by oneself. And we get super passionate about certain issues, and it makes reality difficult because people don't match our passion. They can't see what we see, and they can't feel what we feel. And so we get really disheartened, and then we end up needing to take medications to suppress the passion that we feel. And I feel like maybe one day we won't need to, because that passion and energy will be valued in a way that it's actually utilized in a moment-to-moment basis, and it's not sort of wasted. And maybe if we're able to refine some of our vision, we'll have a sense of where to channel our energy and our efforts, so it's not met with opposition. And what I mean by that is, if I was in a super high mania and I'm just wandering around the streets, I would just go from one thing to the next, using all my energy and passion that I had in the moment. And I would probably meet up with quite a bit of opposition, because I would be trying to help, and maybe somebody doesn't want to help, for example. But if the vision was there, and there was some sort of, it was more refined. It wasn't just me out in society with infinite possibilities of things that I could bump into, and I could bump into trouble. If there was a vision, I would be more activated in the vision versus just being out randomly. That is sort of how it happens at first. If a person goes into mania, they're pretty much doing random stuff. So if we each had our sort of piece of the vision. If we went into that state, we would be able to channel it and keep ourselves out of trouble more. I don't know if that's true, but could be helpful. Not only do we need more options for recovering from a mental health crisis and a mental health diagnosis, I feel we also need more options in the language we choose to talk about it. And perhaps if we talk about it with each other enough, even when we go into the hospital, we will be able to relate what's going on for us in a more coherent way that a person who is working in the system would almost understand what we're saying instead of just looking for mental health symptoms. If we had sort of a collective conversation, we would be speaking in a way that they would almost be like, oh, that actually kind of makes sense. The way you just explained it kind of makes sense. And, I feel like one day we'll be able to not convince, but we'll be able to go in there and be like, this is what's happening for me. I know this is what's happening, and keep me safe for some days and I'll be okay. Not tell me what's wrong with me and give me a label and a diagnosis and then treat me. I feel like one day we'll have the language, we will have had enough conversation about it that we will feel strongly within ourselves. We'll have more of a conviction about what's happening for us. And I don't even know what all that language is. And there's a lot of different language out there. And it would be great to include all of it, because whatever's helpful for each person, if you could think of the best way you can explain it, or you could think of the most coherent way to explain it. You could think about the most magical way to explain it. You could think about the most mysterious way to explain it. And you could think about the most logical way to explain it. There are a lot of different ways. You could explain it in terms of the social context. You could explain it in terms of biochemistry, in terms of orthomolecular psychiatry. There are a lot of different aspects to it. And, the more that we can talk about it in so many different ways, in different dimensions, we'll start to see other solutions for the distress that accompanies it. Because even though I'm talking here about having conversation about it, and also a little bit about, well, let's get our visions and our ideas together, we still have to keep ourselves safe. We still have to go to the hospital if we need to. We still have to take a medication if things are getting too scary, or daily medication if you take daily medication. I do, and I hope one day I don't have to, but I'm not in a rush to prove anything. I don't think, whether it's something besides a brain disease, that's probably a long way off in terms of people actually seeing it a different way. And I feel like first, by talking about it in many ways and seeing it in many ways, that will produce like a huge conversational context through which a person can sort of choose how they want to frame it the most helpful way. But at the same time, even if I choose one day to say, I'm not mentally ill, I'm just a visionary, 10 years down the road, say that happens, and then all of a sudden I start losing it and feel like I'm gonna die or something, I might take some drugs. Like I might take some kind of medication. And because it's important to stay alive. Because even if it is a visionary thing, being in that state can be dangerous because the visions don't always line up with reality and thoughts and the insights. Because the thing is, it's a non-temporal state. There's no time in that state. There's no, and what I mean by that is an insight could come that's related to something 2,000 years ago, and I could have the sense of that. Or it might come and it is from, 2,000 years in the future. And maybe things 2,000 years in the future are different. And if I act based on that insight, whatever it is, thinking that it's now, then I could get myself hurt. Whereas if I take that insight and just make note of it, write it down, talk about it without acting on it, then when I'm in an ordinary state, I can kind of put the pieces of the puzzle together and see if there was anything there. You can think of it as mining. It's like an inner state of, you never know what's going to come up and what's going to come through a person. That was one of my mistakes when I was in mania and psychosis the first time. And I don't think it's a mistake I could have avoided. But it feels like, everything, each moment is so powerful, it feels like it needs to happen now. So if I felt like I'm going to help the world, I'm going to save the world, it has to happen right now. And, if I could take that thought or that feeling and just put it aside and be like, yeah, I want to connect with some kind of purpose or mission in my life. Obviously, that's something that I want. But it doesn't mean I have to do it all now. That's impossible. And that's why I feel like that state, overall, with all the meaning and feeling and passion and energy and compassion and love and scary stuff in that state, in that 2-month period, the first time was like, it's like a seed. It's like all this energy, and it like infuses my entire being. And all of that energy and all of that experience and all of that feeling and meaning inform the being that I am for the rest of my life, in subtle ways or in bigger ways. And it's true, because all of that cumulatively led to being diagnosed with a mental illness and going to the psych ward. And now here I am, wanting to make a different kind of meaning out of it. So there was all that experience that had a different kind of meaning. And then I was diagnosed with a mental illness, and they told me what meaning it had. And I'm here 5 years later saying, I think it had other meaning. And I don't know exactly all the meaning, but it would be cool to talk about it. Because I didn't really talk about it when I was in the state. I was just in it. And, it's like being infected with all that meaning and all that whatever it was. It did infect me. It did change my brain. It did cause a disease. It caused a dis-ease. And, I don't know what to do about it, except for I just want to talk about it, and I just want to invite whatever language you have to explain it or talk about it. Not even explain it, because you can't, it's not something to be explained. Like, there are explanations, and they're all really useful. It's actually useful to have a bunch of different explanations, whether it's, pyrrole disorder, which is a certain biotype of bipolar. It's like a physiology thing. And, whether it's you need the GAPS diet to help with your stomach digestion, which changes the response of the brain. There's a lot of different things. Even the book Interpersonal Neurobiology has a lot of insights into the brain and how that could happen. So there's a lot of different things. And I'm also interested in the language, just creating more language for it and just having more conversation, and creating a bigger context of stories and people's own personal explanations of what is happening. And I really like what's his name? Sean Blackwell's videos on bipolar or waking up. He's like a 20 video series or something, and it's really good. And that's a great way of looking at it. And I could say I'm bipolar and waking up instead of or. I don't think it needs to be an either or thing, and I don't think it's healthy to necessarily talk about it in that way. Because if I was just to resist the diagnosis that I have, that I don't know how helpful that would be. And I'm interested in actually having enough conversation that brings together the mental health system and other ways of talking about it. All that would really look like would be for people that went to some kind of crisis center for help when they're in a mental health crisis, for them to be asked, so what do you feel is going on for you? What's happening inside, what meaning is happening, what's happening internally. And not in a way like, I don't actually care what you have to say, but imagine if it was to the point where a person was asked that, and it was genuine in that the person asking the question actually did want to know what the person experiencing the crisis had to say, and would actually value it, and would actually be interested in it, and would actually take it into account, and it would actually inform the next steps that the person experiencing the crisis would go through. It wouldn't be just some kind of patronizing thing. And the person asking the question would also have all this different language and vocabulary, like a huge vocabulary, to really understand what the person was saying. And even if the person that was saying it didn't really know what they were saying exactly, they would still be understood, because this other person would just really know what kind of language would come out of these experiences. And that doesn't mean they would never use any medication ever. It just means that maybe for some people they would not have to. But so I feel like it's important to include the system, because the system is full of people who do want to help and do care. Yeah, they're people too. So it's just a matter of meeting people with people. And so to me, it's a matter of we're all in this together. I just realized this whole video I look naked, but I'm not. And when I think about meaning and what it means, you know, if we were to think about like what's the meaning of life and everybody's wondering, it's probably the same for everybody. Not in terms of what people think the meaning of life is and sense it, but what it actually is, whatever that is. It's probably very much the same for every single person. So what I'm saying is that, you know, people go into this state of mania and psychosis and they're trying to figure out some kind of meaning, and every moment has different meaning and super meaningful, and maybe none of it's really right per se, but it's still like an attempt for the psyche to find some kind of meaning somewhere. And you know, it's trying to find it, and it finds way too much of it. So if we do imagine that there is just sort of one meaning to life, whatever that may be, it's a shared thing then, like it's shared for all of us, whatever that true meaning is. So it's shared by the world, it's shared by the entire world. And in my feeling, a person in mania experiences a good portion or some portion of it feeling very altruistic, very much concerned with the world. And in that way, to me, those states usually have the ego subside, and then as the ego subsides, there's more of this sort of shared concern about the world. And it's like felt so strongly that it feels like I am the world, like I am all this meaning, I am, you know, I am every meaning that I see. I'm not separate from it. And then as the ego subsides, I really feel that the states are actually a movement towards world centricity. And I came across that term in Ken Wilber's book, The Spectrum of Consciousness. And he talks about just that, world centricity, where a person, their orientation is more towards concerns for the world than just their own individual self. And I think that's part of the thing, is that there's not really that much meaning in, you know, one's own personal little life or one's own personal little gain. You know, we do that, and some people get to the peak of that, and then oftentimes they're unfulfilled. And I feel like mania is like an attempt of evolution in a way to bring about more world-centric beings. You know, like if some people might be taking the psych ward and they're thinking, oh my gosh, the trees, I can't sleep, they're being cut down. And then we think that that's illness. But imagine if everybody took something that seriously and really acted and took it upon themselves to, have one's life, but then really take an active role in something that is very obviously in need of change. And I'm not saying that's the way to go. I just feel that, you know, a person that goes into those states and they're feeling like, I gotta save the world, well, it's pretty hard to do that by oneself. So it would be good if we could get together and talk about world-changing ideas that we've probably already had. We've probably already had 1 million of them, and they're just sitting there on the shelf or in your computer. And I have a lot of ideas, but it would be cool to talk about them with other people, because I can't really do anything by myself, and I don't know if I want to. There's a lot out there about people becoming their own individual entrepreneurs and then having their business and their clients. Well, if there's a person with a business and they need clients, somebody's got to be the client and somebody's got to be the expert. And that's sort of innately what's wrong with the world, is that there's experts and then there's clients, and we're not just getting together and actually trying to just solve some issues. And I think maybe it might be up to us to do that, because everyone else is sort of, normal people. They have their normal life and they're not really going to change that much. Whereas a lot of us, we don't have much to lose. And, we've already lost our minds. So, and we might have some good ideas, and maybe we're kind of attached to them, like, oh, they're my ideas and I don't want to share. But, I think they came to us in those states as a gift that we're supposed to give the world. And if we can't do it individually, because not each one of us can become some little expert entrepreneur, maybe we could form some kind of coalition or group that there's like 1,000 of us with all these great ideas, and we just, since there's so many of us working on whatever it is, you don't really have to do too much, but you can give the gift that you have to give. And maybe when you give that gift, maybe if you have a specific thing that you're like, this is what it was I wanted to give, and you give it to the group, maybe you can move on to the next thing, instead of being like, well, how am I ever going to make this work and bring this about? Just, give it away. Just give it to the group. Probably so many people had the same kind of idea, because it's an idea that doesn't come from our individual brains. It comes out of sort of our meaning and our perception of meaning. And a lot of us probably saw a lot of the same meanings and a lot of the same ideas, or we saw a lot of the same issues that need to be resolved, and perhaps saw ways that might help resolve them. Maybe they won't. Maybe it's all just crazy delusional stuff, and it could be. But I want to know if it is. And maybe just by talking about it with each other, it'll give us something to do. It'll give us, some project to work on, and it could be good.